brace yourself because this episode is going to be drenched in manly testosterone here on the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome to the 66th installment of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm here with my co-host Tom. Paperback Warrior is the internet's first stop for reviews and discussions of 20th century vintage paperback fiction in the crime, adventure, western, spy, and horror genres. We host daily book reviews at paperbackwarrior.com and this weekly podcast on Mondays. Let me bring in Tom to tell us what we have in store for you this week. Tom?
Thanks, Eric. I was thinking that 2020 has been a hard-boiled crime fiction heavy year for us on the podcast. I make no apologies for that because I think we've made a case that an astute reader can draw a straight line from the pulp magazines of the 1930s and 40s to the crime noir of the 1950s and 60s to the men's adventure paperback series titles of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, even to the popular series today starring Mitch Rapp and Jack Reacher. But today we're going to go back to the humble beginnings of Paperback Warrior and review some men's adventure series installments that we felt were noteworthy. After all, you started Paperback Warrior to be a men's adventure fiction blog, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and it was reviewing mostly 80s and 90s action, adventure, and post-apocalyptic stuff. Everything from William W. Johnstone's Last Mountain Man to, stuff like David Alexander's Phoenix series, mostly because it was just the stuff I remembered from my childhood. But once I met you, thankfully you introduced me to a lot of stuff I wasn't, really familiar with in the entire, crime noir genre, I guess. So our landscape is constantly changing. Evident from last week's announcement that we were including vintage horror.
Yeah. So, I think we're giving people a wide variety of stuff that they can enjoy from the 20th century, which is my favorite era of reading books. Anyway, before we get to the main course, I want to tell you about a book hunting trip I went on that really opened the door to a moral dilemma.
Oh.
So you cool with me getting into that?
I love moral dilemmas.
Okay, good. So I needed to go down to the town of Ocala, Florida, the other day on business. Now, Ocala is in the middle of Florida, far from the Atlantic Ocean, far from the Gulf of Mexico. It's actually the hometown of Harry Whittington, who set a lot of his novels in like sweaty, swampy Florida small towns because I guess that was his frame of reference. Now, you've been to Ocala, right?
Yeah, it's a very rural area. It seems to me like it's mostly a senior age community, like the youngsters have left or something.
It's not terribly far from the Villages, which is the largest senior citizen community in all of the United States. Ocala itself, though, has 60,000 people. It's one of 5 cities on planet Earth calling itself the horse capital of the world. It has 44,000 jobs sustained by breeding, training, and supporting the horse industry. Wow. I bet you didn't know that, huh?
Yeah, when I'm down there, I see a ton of horse farms, but I guess I wouldn't doubt that.
It's the big industry. So anyway, like I said, Harry Whittington is from Ocala, but do you know who the second most famous person from Ocala is?
I can't imagine there's another famous person from Ocala.
John Travolta.
Really?
Well, yes and no. See, he was born and raised in New Jersey, but he has a massive mansion in Ocala with not one, but 2 runways for his airplanes. It's worth your time to Google John Travolta's Ocala house if you want to ever see an architectural marvel. But anyway, I'm getting off track. I did not go there to hang out with John Travolta or look for Harry Whittington's gravestone. Well, that would kind of be interesting. I went to Ocala on business on Thursday, and I hit a used bookstore there. On Google, the place is called Ray the Trader, but the sign outside says Ocala Book Paradise. From the outside, it's a dilapidated house with an unattached garage next to it. And as I pull up, Ray and his wife, both people in their 80s, are sitting in the garage. The old lady is asleep on her walker that's got like a seat built into it. And Ray is on a stool reading a contemporary paperback. One thing to know about Ray the Trader is that the bookstore is just a side hustle for the guy. His main source of income is setting up a booth at the Ocala flea market on the weekend selling books, DVDs, and CDs. As a result, the bookstore, get this, Eric, is only open on Thursdays at 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. So you have a 3-hour window of time every week to go to this store. You really got to hit the bookstore, the bullseye, to shop at this Ocala book paradise. So I was the only customer, and so I greeted Ray and his wife. She was asleep the whole time, so I didn't really greet her too much. And then I went inside the house. Now Ray the trader comes inside and sets up on a stool inside the living room, either to provide me with like the valuable customer service that his patrons have come to expect over the decades, or to make sure I'm not going to like start stealing books. Eric, this place was a nightmare. It was like a hoarder house with books and magazines and empty boxes and broken toys everywhere. I have been in plenty of chaotic used bookstores, and I kind of actually enjoy going through them and finding buried treasures, but this place was moldy and disgusting. No air conditioning, and it was like 100 degrees outside. The books were stacked on the floor with one book resting on the ground and like 50 to 100 books stacked on top of the bottom book in these precarious towers, sometimes 3 or 4 towers deep against the walls. About half the books were bagged with saran wrap that had the filth and humidity had darkened so much that you couldn't even see what it said on the spine or see what the book was. If you saw a book you wanted, you really had to gently shimmy it out of the stack or risk an avalanche. I'd never seen anything like it.
I saw some of the photos you were sending while you were down there, and you'd posted a couple of them on Facebook. Man, it looks like an absolute mess and potentially deadly.
Yeah. There were three books that I found there that I would have liked to have owned. One was a Gil Vine mystery by Stuart Sterling. Now, the Gil Vine character was a hotel detective and troubleshooter in a fancy New York hotel. Now, Sterling was a pseudonym for a guy named Prentice Winchell, and he wrote 8 Gil Vine books between 1947 and 1960. They're supposed to be great, but I also know that I think there's 4 different reprint publishers right now currently in an arms race to basically reprint all of this old stuff. So I wasn't panicking about whether I could get that or not. The other one I found was a Fawcett Gold Medal paperback by Wenzel Brown called Run, Chico, Run from 1953. Now, Wenzel Brown was a crime fiction author whose specialty was books about juvenile delinquents. This was a real fascination and fear, I guess, back in the 1950s with the advent of rock and roll. Basically, the greatest generation was terrified that their children, the baby boomers, and would actually like grow up and kill them. Pop culture of that era really reflected those fears, most famously with the 1955 James Dean movie Rebel Without a Cause. So anyway, the juvenile delinquent stuff was Wenzel Brown's literary turf. I've never read anything by him. Are you familiar with him or ever heard of him?
I've got a couple of his books, and I've never read one.
Yeah, me neither. I'd like to, though. So the third book I found was Little Tramp by Gil Brewer. It was a Crest book release from 1957. Now, Gil Brewer and several other authors used to have several books available as reprints from Prologue Press, this vintage ebook reprint from one of the big publishers. But a lot of the Gil Brewer titles, in fact, I think all of them have disappeared and are no longer available. What I think happened, and I had somebody look into this for me, was that the reprint rights expired somehow, and the estate now is controlling the Gil Brewer books, and they didn't want it on Prologue Press for some reason. So I have no idea. I hope that Greg Shepard and Starkhouse can swoop in and reprint those books to keep them available. So Little Tramp is one of those books that was available as an ebook and is now not, but I had this paperback that I found there. Anyway, so I bring all 3 books up to Ray the trader and ask him what the store's pricing structure is. Keep in mind that at this point I'm frustrated and disgusted with this entire place. It's filthy, and I was kind of dressed in business attire because I was there on a work trip, and I'm sweating, and it's just gross. The store was absolutely neglected. There was garbage everywhere, burying the books. It was impossible to navigate your way through the store because there's just stuff all over the ground. And Ray the trader tells me that every book in the store is $6 each. His entire inventory is $6 per book, and he wasn't interested in budging at all on the price. Now, I could argue that these books were worth $6 each, but the store was also filled with like fetid and rotting bestsellers from the past 40 years, books that wouldn't fetch a dime at a library book sale, and those are also supposed to be $6 each. So I put all 3 of those books back, and I left the store in a bad mood. Before I left, though, I asked Ray the trader what the big picture plan was for this shop. I mean, this guy, I have to say, was really old, and he didn't seem to be doing very well health-wise. And I asked if he had family who'd be taking over the shop if something happened to him. And that's the way I phrase it, something happened to him. But he knew where I was going with it. He goes, no, there's no one else but him. And I said, well, what's going to happen to all these books? And he goes, I'll be dead. I don't care. And so I knew that the 3 books that I had dug out of this dank mess of a store are going to wind up in a dumpster when this guy passes away and they bulldoze that hellhole.
Well, considering he's only open 1 day a week, it's clear that this really isn't a priority. I imagine the guy had some life failures and some disappointments along the way. He probably has no family connections. Maybe his children are estranged or just don't want to deal with him. It sounds like his wife's not in good health either. At the same time, knowing that this stuff is rotting away, I mean, he should be ecstatic that you're even walking into the place.
I know. It was, again, I don't have any problem with the guy himself. I mean, who knows what issues he's dealing with in his life, but from a business sense, none of this made sense to me in any way, shape, or form. Like, why even bother opening? So I tell a version of the story with photos in the Men's Adventure Paperback Facebook group, and mostly got a lot of shock and sympathy from group members. But one guy challenged me. It was our old friend Justin Marriott from England, who produces a lot of those great fanzines about vintage paperbacks, including Men of Violence, one that we've written for. And Justin commented, he basically said, the books you showed were beat up, but considering the authors, genres, and publishers, they are $6 books. Justin says he would have snatched those books up at $6 a piece. Then he goes, I find it puzzling that paperback fans bemoan the death of the used bookstore whilst also refusing to pay more than $2 per book. Then he goes through the amount that an owner would have to sell to make a comparable wage if he had gotten a job working at Walmart. And Justin thinks that we should all be willing to pay $5 a book just to keep the industry viable. And so I was chewing on this, and I want to hear from you. What do you think of Justin's point? Should we pay more for used books just to keep this dying industry afloat?
Yes, but it isn't because I suck at bargaining, and you know that. Mm-hmm. And it isn't because I consider Justin a friend and a frequent collaborator with Paperback Warrior either. The truth of the matter is, when you posted those 3 books on Facebook and you said you'd walked away, here's what I did. I texted my wife, and I told her I was taking the following Thursday off from work. And I sent her a photo of the book stacks and told her I was diving in with at least $18. And she kindly explained to me that her daughter, which is my stepdaughter, has really bad asthma and that the place is filled with mold and nastiness, which is true. So I'm not going to visit that establishment, but normally would and wouldn't hesitate to give $6 for some vintage book that has somehow survived 60-plus years on Earth. So think about this, Tom. If you go out to Abe Books or Thrift Books, I think you frequent there, and you see free shipping on a Gil Brewer or Lionel White Fawcett Gold Medal, you know, I'm already halfway interested when I see free shipping. And if the price is $6 or $10, I'm extremely happy.
I buy it like that, without question.
Okay, so you literally had the books in your hand. You aren't even caught up in the whole mail fiasco or tracking a package or anything like that. Plus, you know it is the item you want, the right publisher, the right cover. You literally have the goods in your hand. It's a sense of entitlement. It can be yours right after the transaction. Now, saying that, now if the book was, like all taped up and the cover's ripped off and the pages are falling out of the binding, I might not want to pay $6 just to read it. I want to own and keep the book for $6, not read it while simultaneously throwing pages in the trash can. There has to be some quality control, like the bookseller that you talked about a couple of weeks ago that gave you Ovid Damaris's The Slasher. Yeah. And they wanted, I think, $6 for it, or $10. $8. Yeah. And then they found out the pages were falling out of it, and they just gave it to you for free. Right. Because they can't resell that. I thought about this too. Comparing this place that you went to, which I don't really consider a store, this place compared to the quaint, well-organized little Jacksonville store we called, or was called Black Sheep Books. Yes. They just recently closed up shop. Right. But it was a happy ending for the store owner, as we both know. But in the store's final days, I'd ask him what would happen to the books that wouldn't sell. And he confidently smiled at me, and he said they will all be sold. And Tom, he even told me to bring in some boxes and just grab anything I wanted, and he'd do 50 cents a book. And I think I acquired about 70% of the Stony Farm series and Super Mac Boland series just because they were cheap and because of his generosity. But you look at guys like that realize what they have and they know they can't take it with them or whatever, and they're happily selling it off. But anyway, I'm digressing.
I guess I was offended that zero thought actually went into the pricing of Trader Ray's inventory. I also told Justin that every sale is just a meeting of the minds between buyer and seller, and that any product, including books, is only worth as much as a buyer is willing to pay. in an arm's length transaction, right? So when pricing a used book, a seller needs to consider his carrying cost, the cost of the inventory, and just the opportunity cost on what else could be in that shelf space. One of my favorite used bookstores in Chicago, and they have very high prices, but I don't complain because there's clearly a lot of thought that went in to the pricing and the preservation of that guy's inventory. I would have gladly paid that guy $10 for Little Tramp by Gil Brewer, that store on Belmont Avenue in Chicago, but I just didn't feel right giving money to someone who clearly didn't give a darn about his store, his customers, his inventory, or the books themselves.
So I think what you're saying is that if he was a little bit more enthusiastic about his store and had things in their place and maybe it wasn't as dirty, you would be happy to give him the $6.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is it was $6 for that book, but it was also $6 for the cookbook, like filled with actual cockroach droppings on the floor. Geez. Everything was $6, and that was just it sort of put me on tilt.
I mean, if anything, the guy goes, "Hey, you're going to buy 3 books. Let's do $15 or let's do $12 or something like that, and mark them down for you." But
whatever, yeah. So anyway, that's my October horror story of the week.
That is a horror story.
Yeah, there's better bookstore options around Ocala. So hit me up if you want any advice as far as where to go there. And anyway, so let's do the feature, Eric. Play some music. As I mentioned in the show opener, we want to circle back around to the men's adventure series fiction this episode. People can quibble about how it all began, but I trace the roots of men's adventure fiction to Don Pendleton's Executioner #1, War Against the Mafia, published in 1969. It not only launched the successful Mac Bolan series, but it also launched really an entire industry and genre. When we say men's adventure fiction, we're not being sexist. That's what the genre was called, and it was listed as such on the spines of the paperbacks themselves. Pinnacle Books and Gold Eagle Books were really the prestige publishers in this unprestigious genre, but nearly every other paperback imprint tried to get into the act. And so today we want to talk about some of the copycat series titles that emerged in the wake of Don Pendleton's success. So, Eric, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about this Death Merchant series by Joseph Rosenberger, and maybe give us a review of one of the installments.
Cool, yeah. So Pinnacle added Death Merchant to their catalog of titles and began publishing it in 1971. And as you mentioned earlier, the series was written by Joseph R. Rosenberger, and it featured a character named Richard Chameleon, a globe-trotting CIA agent. Along with his cunning military tactics, Chameleon is a master of disguises, and that allows him to infiltrate hostile forces, both as a spy and a combatant.
How convenient that his name is Chameleon right. And he's a master of disguises. What are the odds?
It's pretty cheesy. It reminds me of the Avenger, who had the face that he can mold and become different people. The series ran 71 installments from 1971 through 1988, including a double-sized novel, Super Death Merchant Apocalypse, which they probably borrowed from the Super Bowl idea, but it was extremely successful. The general consensus is that the earlier novels are the best. So because of that, I recently grabbed the 13th installment, the Mato Grosso Horror, which was originally published in 1975. The idea behind this one might be a familiar one to fans and listeners and you, Tom, as well. Readers of the men's adventure magazines, which are often called MAMs or MAMs. The concept is that Nazis escaped Germany at the end of World War II, and then they emerged years later in secluded exotic locations. These Nazis still swear allegiance to Hitler, and they haven't abandoned their quest to enslave the human race. So normally these stories have the Nazis experimenting on villagers and natives and making them some sort of super soldier. So taking all this into consideration, the Death Merchant, Richard Chameleon, gets ordered to go to Brazil to eliminate these Nazis in the inner portion of the country, which is vastly an unexplored area called Mato Grosso. The Death Merchant partners with a squad of American Green Berets, and the early chapters have the heroes battling these Nazi assassins as they set out battle plans and begin mapping out the area. Like the old horror movie Cannibal Holocaust, the Death Merchant must battle savage tribes that orchestrate all these violent, graphic things to their enemies. And I was kind of hoping that the enemies would be a bit more dynamic, but the author doesn't really spend much time on making them strong opponents. Instead, it's kind of like a video game. Death Merchant just kills and kills and kills, and he mows down all the baddies. And that's sort of what you can expect from the series. It was fun, but I treat this series like a vacation. I only do it once or twice a year. It's about all the violent killing I really need in my life, I think. But the Mato Grosso Horror is Death Merchant number 13, written by Joseph R. Rosenberger.
Did you ever read Death Merchant #1?
No.
It sucked. It was so bad. It was so bad. It was like I have not revisited the series, but I'm told that the one to read is the Shambhala one.
Okay.
Everyone says that's the best one because it's like just told. It's wild and wacky and crazy, but I'm told it's actually kind of good. I can't remember the full name of it, but it's something Shambhala.
Did you ever read the Butcher series?
Yeah, I read a couple of the Michael Avallone ones. They were okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to talk about a weird one. It was a series that only lasted 3 books. It was called CAT, C-A-T, Crisis Aversion Team, by the very manly author name of Spike Andrews. I actually had an opportunity to interview the creator of this series back in 2018, and I wrote an unmasking article telling who he really was, and you can read that at paperbackwarrior.com. Anyway, so I want to tell a little bit about the background of the series. It was 1982, and Warner Books had a hit on their hands with their Dirty Harry original paperback series. And they wanted to create a buddy cop series along the same lines as part of the publisher's new Men of Action brand of paperback books. And so the Crisis Aversion Team series by Spike Andrews featured frenetic action and sex and violence to satisfy this men's adventure market that was really thriving in the early 80s. The plan was to release a monthly cat book and watch the cash just pour in. Unfortunately, sales were not very good, and the new editors at Warner Books decided to cancel publication after releasing only 3 installments. And the world never really heard from that Spike Andrews author again, whoever he was. That is, until Paperback Warrior tracked him down. The series was actually created by a Canadian author by the name of Dwayne Schemmerhorn, who had previously written a Fawcett Gold Medal heist novel called Hard to Kill that you read and reviewed on the blog. And so I interviewed Dwayne, and he told me that he had met with an editor at Warner Books to understand what kind of series the Cat was supposed to be. And the company wanted a high-volume series with books published every couple months. That sort of pace really can't be maintained, though, by a single writer, and so there needed to be at least 2 writers and more if the series really took off. So the 2 writers were contracted to write 3 books each. Dwayne wrote number 1, 3, and 5, and a writer in North Carolina named George Ryan was to write numbers 2, 4, and 6. So Dwayne Schemmerhorn writes the Bible for Cat to ensure series continuity among any author that would have to write a book in this thing. And after the release of Cat #1, the editor sent a note to Dwayne requesting more sex and more violence. So in book number 3, he raises the level of sex and violence to what he described as near parody. He wrote all 3 books, and he was contracted to do, and he assumed that his co-author did the same. But because the series didn't do well, only the first 3 were actually published. And that was the end of the Cat series. So books 1 through 3 came and went, no fanfare, and they exist today as collector's items for men's adventure paperback fans like you and I. Books 4 through 6 never saw publication, and it's unlikely that they will ever be read by anyone. Anyway, I read the first book in the series, Cat #1. It's called Tower of Blood. It was a lot of fun. It introduces New York City police officers Stuart Weston and Vincent Santillo. Together they form the core of the Crisis Aversion Team of the NYPD, a group assigned the touch-and-go suicides, the murders with racial overtones, the snipers high-flying and shooting wild, and the desperate hostage holders, the bomb scares and bomb blasts. As you can see, Warner Brothers had big plans for this versatile duo, and what the novel actually delivers, though, is a violent but really kind of run-of-the-mill police-based action novel. A police informant is gunned down in Harlem at a tavern before he can pass on valuable information. And so our hero cops are set out to understand why he's killed. That's the basic plot. The opening carnage at the bar is really just pure 1980s bloodbath filled with heads exploding and rifle slugs ripping into flesh and bones, followed by a violent chase and shootout that goes on for pages and pages and pages. It doesn't take long before the reader's introduced to a local drug dealer who has it out for the Cat Boys, basically for doing their jobs. Meanwhile, our hero cops follow logical clues to get closer to the source of all this mayhem, which takes them from the slums to Manhattan's power elite. And they bust a lot of skulls and leave dead bodies in their wake. And eventually there's a climactic kidnapper with hostages standoff. For action-oriented readers, the authors did not skimp on long action, chase, and gunfight scenes. Trust me, they go on forever in Tower of Blood. It's basically like a John Woo action movie set to print. I can definitely recommend it if you're like an adrenaline junkie. So the book again is Cat Number 1, Tower of Blood, and it's under the name Spike Andrews. But finally, some good and bad news. The good news is that the book is actually available on Kindle right now for $5 if you want to read it. Warner Books put it out again. The bad news is that when I interviewed Dwayne Shemmerhorn, it was the first time that anyone had ever spoken to him about his writing career in the men's adventure genre. And he seemed excited that anyone would actually have remembered and enjoyed his body of work in the paperback fiction world. So after my interview with him, but before publication of the article, I received word that Dwayne died from a ruptured aortic aneurysm on September 28, 2018. And so I feel really terrible that he never got to read the article that I wrote about him or listen to this podcast. But I guess I'm just sort of happy that you and I, Eric, can play a small part in remembering this aspect of his creative life. Anyway, let me throw it back to you. You can tell me I want to hear you about this Enforcer series by Andrew Sugar. The covers make him look a lot like Mac Bolan clones, but the premise of the series is actually really interesting and innovative.
Yeah, definitely. I've really grown to like this series a lot, and I've got all the books now after seeking them out. So Lancer, which is sort of a low-end publisher, released the Enforcer debut in 1973. It was the series debut that lasted 4 volumes with the publishing group before Manor ended up purchasing the line and releasing 2 more. And they even included some of the earlier ones with just better art. The series was written and created by Andrew Sugar, who would later contribute for Argosy as well as books in the Israeli Commandos line. And he also did some standalone titles like Yank, which I think we both own.
Yeah, I got that.
And the author seemed to retire from writing around 1979. Now, Andrew Sugar actually became a woman.
Yeah, he transitioned. He became Andrea Sugar.
Andrea Sugar.
Yeah.
But I don't think he ever wrote anything under Andrea Sugar.
No, he didn't.
Yeah. So the Enforcer series stars a guy named Alex Jason. And in the opening book, which is called The Enforcer, we learned that Jason was a successful author who was dying from stomach cancer. Now, Jason was a skilled martial artist, and he was in great physical shape prior to cancer. And now he's weak, and he weighs less than 100 pounds. So Jason entertains an offer from this delivery that he gets, which is a mysterious hologram. And he opens this thing up in his living room, and he's told that he can live an additional 2 years if he wants to contribute his services to the John Anron Institute. Now, how is this possible for a terminal cancer patient? Simple. This millionaire entrepreneur named Flack has invented successful body growing, which is ultimately just cloning. So Flack can simply place Jason's mind in perfect bodies that he has grown from cells. And after about 90 days, the body will essentially melt, and Jason will need to be replaced into a new body. Each time this happens, the brainwaves become a little duller. It's not a flawless process, but Jason understands all the risk.
That's cool. So he's got these temporary bodies that basically turn to soup after 90 days. He's got to get his adventure done during that window of time before they transfer him to a new body.
Yeah, and the bodies look different. And it's kind of like when Bruce Wayne goes into the Batcave and picks out a bat costume. It's kind of like that. He can go into this laboratory and pick out what body he wants.
That's kind of neat. I love the premise.
Now, Andrew Sugar has a lot of graphic sex in these books because these bodies have enormous penises.
Oh, good. If you're going to pick a body, you might as well get one that's fully equipped.
So because of his martial arts skills that he can remember from his, he still has his mind, it's not his body, but he has this thing called ki, which allows him not to really feel any pain and allows him to concentrate on the assignment, which the Institute sends him out to do secret assignments, which are really just kind of like vigilante assignments. It kind of reminded me of what Hawker does in those series, where this billionaire wants him to go out and do vigilante-type things to basically rid the world of evil. Now, I hated the first book. I absolutely hated it, and I got to thinking maybe I didn't want to read it again. I just thought it was absolutely ridiculous. But the second novel kind of got me into the series. It was called Calling Dr. Kill, and I don't have the publication date listed, but it would have been probably 73 or 74. In the novel, protagonist Alex Jason is requested by the Institute to infiltrate a complex hospital which is operated by the Syndicate. And, of course, Jason's provided a new body and an identity as a new doctor hired by the hospital. And the mission is to free up a Dr. Rosegold, who's the brilliant mind behind the whole transferring to a new body routine. Rosegold is a brilliant entrepreneur with a tremendous skill set, so he becomes a target for the syndicate, and they've got him captured in this coma-like state inside this heavily fortified hospital in an attempt to pry all the information on the body transfer process, because the bad guys want basically to create immortal mobsters. They could just have mobsters in all these perfect bodies, and they could just live forever. So aim high, shoot high, I guess. But this book was really good. It had a lot of suspense, a lot of thrilling action scenes, and I thought it just worked out really, really well. So I love that book, and I also liked the third one, which was called Kill City, which was released in 1973 by Lancer. And I just recently, well, I guess last year, I read Kill Deadline, which was the fourth book, and I thought it was really good as well. So I've got 2 more books to go, but I love this series other than the debut.
Good, excellent. And the name of the series, again, is The Enforcer by Andrew Sugar.
Yes.
Now, Eric, you are the resident expert here, so I'm going to make a special request. I've seen books in a series called The Terminator by John Quinn. Now, this has nothing to do with the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. It's a different Terminator. What strikes me about the series is that it was Pinnacle Books' effort to create confusion in the bookstores by making the font and cover art look exactly like Don Pendleton's Executioner novels. But you actually read the Terminator books. Why don't you tell us about it just for a few minutes?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, I borrowed them from you because I don't think you were ever going to read them.
No.
I pulled them off your shelf. So according to Bradley Mingle's resourceful serial vigilantes of paperback fiction, author John Quinn is a pseudonym for Dennis Rodriguez. Believe it or not, Rodriguez worked with Ed Wood Jr. at Pendulum Press and served as editor for Triple X Mags.
Oh, nice.
So other than the novel Pachuco, I can't really locate any other titles that Rodriguez wrote. Terminator series, it ran 6 volumes and it was produced by Pinnacle. In the series, the hero is a guy named Rod Gavin, and he was a Marine in Vietnam and now works assignments as an assassin for the CIA. His contract with Langley, under supervisor Chet Barnes, requires 8 hits before he can either retire or opt out into another military branch. And so after departing his rural home in Colorado, he's got this mountain, this high mountain pass house. He receives some intel regarding his 8th and last assignment. He's got to kill a guy named Jorge De Leon, who's really a kind of a bad guy that's leading a bunch of terrorists in a place called Costa Bella. What the reader knows that Gavin doesn't is that De Leon hasn't gone rogue at all, and he's really an inside man sent by the U.S. president to spy on Costa Bella's government and their treatment of the civilian uprising. So Gavin is told that this guy's a bad guy and he wants him killed, but it was really just a setup. So Gavin ends up killing the guy, becomes a setup, and then he ends up getting hunted down and essentially wanting to be removed. So apparently you can't retire from that particular branch of the military. They kept feeding him the line.
Sort of a drag.
Yeah, they kept feeding him a line like, you only got to do these 8 more hits and then you're out and you can retire and go to Colorado, but that wasn't the case. So he ends up getting set up, and the whole premise is him basically getting back to all the people that set him up. It was a really good book. It was originally published by Pinnacle in 1982, and like you said, the font and layout is identical with the Mac Bolan books. In fact, the artwork was created by Gil Cohen, which did
same guy, same artist.
Did a lot of Executioner books.
Makes sense.
I've read, I'm looking at the blog, I've read the first volume, the second volume, which was called Silicon Valley Slaughter. That was really good. And I've read the fourth one, which was called Crystal Kill. But it's a really great series. It gets knocked a lot, I guess, just because of its rip-off status of ripping off.
It doesn't sound like the content is like a rip-off of Mac Bolan.
No.
It's just the marketing.
Right, exactly. It's a great story, great premise, and it's well written.
Well, that's good. I think we could go on like this for hours, but we should probably pace ourselves because we're only 66 episodes into our 1,000-episode run. So you ready to tap out?
Yeah, definitely. So like they say in show business, always leave them wanting more, I guess.
And with that, we're going to conclude our 66th episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. Please join us on Facebook and Twitter to continue the conversation. But most importantly, check out our daily book reviews at paperbackwarrior.com with archives going back for years and years and years. You never have an excuse to say, I have no idea what I should read next. If you can, review us on iTunes and consider donating to the show via PayPal to keep us ad-free. There's a link to our PayPal on our homepage. On behalf of my boss, Eric, this is Tom signing off. We will see you next Monday.